All right, good evening. All right, we have about 90 million minutes together. We have about 50 minutes together. I'm going to do some presenting. I'm going to do some talking. I'm going to invite you to ask questions if you'd like along the way. I may punt the question till later if it makes sense and it's what's best for the group. What else do I want to say? So I'll just start off. My name is, Ilana Kaufman. I'm the CEO of the Jews of Color Initiative. And I want you to know that I grew up just down the hill in the Western Addition. And my experience at Shereth Israel as a young person, I think, deeply informed how I think about my work as a Jewish community leader now. And we can talk about some of that tonight. But what I want to say was there was quite some distance between my experience here in the 1980s. There was some distance between me and my learning. There was some distance between me and my relationship to Jewish text and Jewish thought and Jewish study. There was some distance between me and what I needed to know about the Middle East, particularly as a person of color moving through the world. And this distance really did send me away in some ways from the organized Jewish community. I never left Jewish life. But it did send me away from organized Jewish community for some time. And what brought me back in some ways is my now almost 18-year-old Noah. Because when we were preparing for their arrival, the things that I wanted for them were the things that I had as a young Jewish person. The sense of community, the opportunity to be in connection. Leisha right here and I went to Sunday school right here together. And we're still friends. And we're still colleagues and we're still in community. And I wanted that for Noah. And so I think in some ways the Jews of Color Initiative has been an expression of, I won't say bridge building, because I don't think the JoCI, as we like to call it, is a bridge builder. The way I like to think about it is we provide, like when a building comes online, a brand new building comes online, and the connection is made, and then you got to activate the connection, you got to energize the connection. I think of the work that we do as energizing the connections for the community and helping illuminate and illustrate the connections that are already here. We help build in these connections, and then we help ignite them. We started the Jews of Color Initiative in around 2016, 2017, and the JoCI was started at the invitation of a group of funders in the Jewish community. And their question for us was something like, to what extent does racism affect you as Jewish people? The context, of course, was that black and brown people were being gunned down in the streets in the United States. And there was, I think, in some ways, what we in the Jewish community, and I'll just make that very broad for now, like to call a racial reckoning. I don't know that Jews of color felt like it was a racial reckoning. I don't know that black people feel like it was a racial reckoning, but I know that the organized Jewish community felt like it was a racial reckoning. And in that racial reckoning, there was an invitation for 12 Jews of color to gather to share with the funders what our experiences were as people of color in this community. I think it's important to state that there was a bias, I think, built in even to the invitation, which was something about, to what extent does your Jewishness protect you from racism? And is your experience as black Jewish people the same as regular black people? And it comes from the fact that as Jews, first of all, we work hard to create a container of safety in this community. And we work hard to imagine that our Jewishness in some way transcends other kinds of oppression or marginalization. And I think unique, specifically in our work is specifically focused on the United States, it became very clear that in no way does our Jewishness protect us from racism. And in fact, in some ways, it further reinforces racism, particularly in our own community. And we'll talk some more about that. In 2016, 2017, at the invitation of funders, we were invited to create a pilot idea, which was, do Jewish people of color want to gather? Do Jewish people of color want to be part of the larger Jewish community, and do you need money to do that? And so the Jews of Color Initiative was born to help answer those questions. And we started off as a grant-making organization. In our first pilot year, we made $110,000 in grants to about 4 organizations. You'll see in a little bit, but in 22, 23, we did something like $800,000 in grant making, and we now fund something like 40 or 50 organizations in the US. While we were born to help answer the question of what do Jews of color need in the United States, what we really do now is different. We build power, we build infrastructure, and we build organizations and leaders for the Jewish community, and we do that by doing capacity building, technical assistance, we make grants, like I said, and we provide research for the community, and I'll talk about some of that tonight. We invest in Jewish continuity. We'll see some of the data, but about 1 million of the 7 million Jews in the United States look like me, or self-identify as people of color. And so if we don't get ourselves right in this country around racism in the US Jewish community, we chance further separating out a huge swath of the US Jewish community, and then it becomes even more problematic when you consider that somewhere between 20 and 25% of the US Jewish communal families identify as multiracial. And so those are families where you might only see the white person at the Jewish communal engagement opportunity, but they're scouting for the rest of their family. And they're testing for safety, they're testing for context, they're testing for relevance, they're testing for community. So we care a lot about Jewish continuity. The young people in our community, ages 0 to 18, something like 20% of that community are people of color, and that number gets bigger every day. And so this is not like a theoretical exercise about to what extent or when will we become a multiracial community. We already are. The question is, when will we integrate our US Jewish community and its leadership and its narrative to reflect the reality of the US Jewish community? And can we do that before this community further dissolves and racism negatively impacts not only the US Jewish community, but all of us in general? We care about access, and so we believe that Jews of color and all Jews, of course, should have unencumbered access to community. I like to think about it as unencumbered access to Torah. Every Jewish person should be able to walk into a synagogue and be able to have an unencumbered relationship, full stop. We're here to help defeat white supremacy. Our interest is not in just abolishing anti-Semitism. If we do that, we forget that anti-Semitism has a partner, which is racism, and that rolls up into white supremacy. And when the white supremacists are coming after us, they're going to come kill us all. And so we have a very, very potent and powerful value proposition of being in relationship with each other. And if we don't figure out how to navigate racism, we are not going to be able to maintain coalitions to defeat anti-Semitism. And as our relationships and our communities become more diverse, the focus on anti-Semitism obfuscates from the danger to all of Jews and all our families because we're multiracial. And so we got to really expand our aperture. We believe deeply in helping to reinforce Jewish knowledge and pride. We're proud to be Jewish. We think we should feel proud to be Jewish. And in order to maintain Jewish continuity, we have to be knowledgeable as Jews. And if we can't have access to Torah, if we can't have access to community, if we can't have access to engagement, we can't become knowledgeable. And so there's a responsibility there, and we are charged. We have an obligation, l'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. We relied on somebody, and there are people relying on us. And so we have to make sure that the knowledge pathways are open. And then, of course, we care about equity and justice. And whether or not we fully embrace it, the US was established and structured on a racial hierarchy and on racism and racial bias, and it has seeped into every aspect of our community, including our US Jewish community. And there's a reason why 1 in 7 Jews are people of color, but we don't see a room that looks the same way. There's a reason why the narrative of the US Jewish community communicates an aesthetic that not only doesn't reflect on Jews of color, it flattens Jews of all backgrounds, right? It's not like Romanian Jews and Polish Jews and German Jews are the same. But that's also a cost of racism too in the United States, and we have to talk about that. I've already said a lot. Does anybody want to ask anything before I go on? And we're not going to get to all the slides. I'll send them to you. We're never going to get to all of the slides. I do that on purpose. So just a little bit about the JoCI. So we do 3 things at the Jews of Color Initiative. We are the country's only philanthropic fund focused on Jewish people of color. And we're like a United Way in the sense that we raise money from institutional funders and then we give it away. And so in 2022, 2023, we did just under $750,000 in grant making to 36 organizations and 45 grants. And so we are a busy, busy, busy shop. And we have a team of 3 full-time grant makers that help facilitate this process. Underneath those grants, you also have capacity building, technical assistance. We teach people how to make budgets. We teach people how to do leadership development. We have executive coaching for everybody. We teach you how to do an audit. We help build out 501c3s. And so all of this is to help continue to build infrastructure so that not only Jews of color have access to resources, but we're creating our own resources and creating our own programs and the vision of their own visions. So we've done 2 major studies here in the US, and I just read the second draft of the MOU for our 3rd study. Our first study was called, so the second thing we do is research. And let me just pause for a second and say we did not start off to be a research organization. I am not a PhD data scientist, although I'd like to play one on TV. When we started the Jews of Color Initiative, we would go out and talk about Jewish people of color, and we'd be like 12 minutes into a conversation or like 17 minutes into a conversation, far too long to interrogate the thesis and the premise of our presence. And we'd be in like the middle of a sentence, and then somebody would inevitably raise their hand, and it would go something like this. I went to camp, and you can just fill it in, Ramah. I like to pick on Camp Ramah. They always have gone to Camp Ramah. I went to Camp Ramah. My kids went to Brandeis. I was on the board of whatever, and I've never seen any Jews of color. How many Jews of color are there really? And it was like always, always, always. And I finally was like, first of all, like, I'm sorry that you went through a lifetime of Jewish education and you were not taught the truth about your own community. And here you are in leadership, and you are leading from a place where you have a narrow view. That's deeply problematic, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's the course we need to correct. And so we went to where all the Jewish data is. So there's these Jewish data banks with all the data about us in them. But that's not all of us, it's just some of us in there. And we tried to find out about how many Jews of color there were, and there was no data in the US that answered that question. And so our first study, Counting Inconsistencies, we commissioned Ari Y. Kelman, who's one of the chairs of Jewish Studies and Education down at Stanford, to help us answer the question. What we learned are a couple of things. One is, at a minimum, somewhere around 15 to 20% of the US Jewish community, like I said, are self-identified people of color. We also learned in that study that the quality of the studies themselves was pretty terrible. And that, you know, researchers talk about, and I know there are some in the room, garbage in, garbage out. In this case, we were looking at the top quality studies in the US Jewish community. And not only were there no parallel structures, so you couldn't compare the data across communities, but it would ask things like in the racial category, are you Hasidic? Are you Sephardic? Are you Latino? All in the same racial category. And these were like major federations and the Jewish data banks. And so the result was not only helping the country establish a sense of data of numbers about how many Jewish people of color there are, but we also helped, I say that generously, we helped the major research houses, including Brandeis University, change their pedagogy for their demographic studies. And so moving forward, not only do they include diversity and people of color, but they create parallel structures so we can start to compare data. And that's really, really important. For the sake of the work, the way we think about Jews of color at the Jews of Color Initiative is a conceptual framework and not a definition, and that's really important. And the framework uses the base structure of the US Census, so Black, African American, Asian, white is in there, Latino, Latine, Latinx, multiracial, Native American. And then for the sake of the framework, because we're talking about Jews, we add in Middle Eastern and North African. We then create a subcategory for Sephardic and Mizrahi. And then there's subcategories for like Beta Israel, people from India, Bukharian Jews, and so forth. And you self-select into the identity. And so that's what shapes the framework for this. We'll talk about it in a minute, but when we did Beyond the Count, which I'll mention in just a second, out of the 1,118 respondents, 12 also identified as white. And so in this context, you also have people who identify as both being of color and as white at the same time. We'll get into the rest of it in just a minute. Okay. We've done this. Okay. So then the second study is called Beyond the Count, and it's about the perspectives, experience, and beliefs of Jews of color. This is not a representative study, it's a snowball study. And we had representatives from 47 different states and Puerto Rico in the respondents. And so one very important, I saw some of your heads just go, wow. One of the really, really important takeaways, and I think about if the Jews of color, which is like 11 full-time staff, we're pretty lean. If we can find Jews of color in 47 states and Puerto Rico, like imagine. Imagine what the Jewish people can do, right? And if we can do it on a dime, like imagine what the Jewish people can do. In this study, the sort of important takeaways include that, first of all, let me just say, so the responses from this study focused on Jewish identity, engagement in Jewish communities, systematic racism in Jewish spaces, and a sense of belonging. And I actually, I do think this is a great study. And for people who like research and data and articulations of studies, I don't want to say like curl up with it with like a glass of your favorite beverage, but it's a great study and it's beautifully articulated and it's a very complex study and it's worth looking at if you like that sort of thing. In addition, okay, so the findings included a bunch of different data points that I want to bring up. One, 2/3 of the survey respondents said that they have felt disconnected in their Jewish identities, and half altered how we speak, dress, present ourselves in predominantly white Jewish settings. And so whatever the environmental characteristics are, most Jews of color who move through Jewish communal spaces feel disconnected from our identity sometimes, and like we have to change ourselves to fit into traditional Jewish settings. 80% of Jews of color in the study share that they face discrimination in Jewish settings, particularly in spiritual or congregational settings. And what does that look like? I mean, it looks like every time a Jew of color goes to a community that doesn't know them and they don't know us, and we speak Hebrew, for example, or if we daven in Hebrew, somebody says, why is your Hebrew so good? People still ask you, were you adopted? When did you become Jewish? People still interrogate Jewish people of color and think that they work as a maintenance staff, for example, in communal environments. I think that the experiences of discrimination go further around access to communal services, for example. And so one of the ways we think about that is we fund grants around, we train mikvah guides. We don't train mikvah guides, but some of the finest organizations in the country train JoCI mikvah guides. Because one of the most important experiences that you have if you're becoming Jewish or if you're participating in Jewish life and that's part of your ritual experience is to have that not be a negative experience. And it's already extremely vulnerable. And so what does it mean if you could actually have somebody who looks like you or might share your experience? The same way you think about Hever Kadisha. And that you want to have somebody who makes you feel safe as you think about the way you experience death and dying. And so beyond just being stereotyped or experiencing racism, there are major, major parts of Jewish life where we need to be expanded in terms of who we expect to walk into the room, how we expect people to conduct themselves when we walk into the room, and what's expected of us when people walk into the room. Slightly over half of the respondents said that we felt a sense of belonging among white Jews, and so it's not all bad news, okay? And 41% is not like a winning percentage, okay? Almost all Jews of color, we feel scrutinized for our race in settings, and we feel othered. And so the other piece is around thinking about when do we welcome JoCI into spaces? When do we tokenize Jews of color and say, like, would you join this thing because we want your opinion? I want to join your thing because you want me on your audit committee. And what I mean by that is this. If you want to invite a Jew of color or anybody really to join you in a project or an effort, and you're not asking us to join you for a specific skill, a specific talent, a specific area of interest or passion that I have, and you just want me because you want to meet a demographic goal, then that's tokenizing. The minute you can reach for somebody and say, I want you because you're amazing at this, and then you get to know us over time and space, that's one way that we can navigate tokenizing. Many Jews of color describe being in community and being in relationships with other Jews of color as profoundly healing. And so I think it's also important to imagine an entire lifetime of moving through spaces where people don't look like you. And lifetime can be brief, lifetime can be long. Or moving into spaces where there are no clergy to help model for you who you might be or who you could be. And how important it is to be in spaces where people share your experience. And I will say, you know, I've been in this role, I'm in my 8th year, and I was in Los Angeles on Wednesday night giving a talk to a group of Jews of color. And I am both surprised and humbled every time I'm in a room where an adult Jewish person of color walks into a room and has never been in a room with other Jews of color. And imagine your own lives moving through Jewish spaces and having nobody like you. And what it's like to walk into a room and have some reflection of yourself for a first time. Every Jew deserves that experience, whatever our backgrounds are. The other thing that was really, I think, very deep about Beyond the Count was beyond the experiences that have been negative, Jews of color are deeply, deeply, deeply engaged in Jewish life. Very educated, in some cases overeducated and overtrained, and we can talk about why that is if you want. And so what we know is that Jews of color are a tremendous community partner who very often come very well prepared, very engaged, and quite capable, in some ways over-prepared relative to our peers. And so when people tell me, like, I can't find any qualified Jews of color to do anything, my question for them is what's getting in the way for you? Because it's often not an absence of talent around us. It's often because there's a headwind in the way, and that's often racism. So what do we hope is true in 10 years? I would say, you know, the Jews of Color Initiative, if the US Jewish community doesn't begin to embody the reality that we are multiracial as a community, and doesn't begin to embody the reality that racism is keeping us apart from each other, and we have not yet dealt with and developed skills to navigate this in ways that actually bridge the community, and not only bring Jews of color into predominantly white spaces to enrich those predominantly white spaces, but create community to transform into a new version of ourselves, one that is multiracial. We hope and we need that to happen. And what that means is the aesthetic will start to change. The demographic of a room will start to change. What we talk about will start to change. How we talk about it will start to change, and that's a good thing. We hope that by centering and anchoring the experiences of Jews of color, that we become better neighbors to all of the people, all of the diversity around us. The US is going to be a majority people of color by 2042. 2044, depending on immigration patterns and migration patterns and such. And so us developing facility as a multiracial Jewish community helps us develop facility as a multiracial community. And we need to pilot and test our skills in an environment where we actually are in relationship with each other. And so I think we have just tremendous promise and potential to do that in this kind of environment. I very much hope that all Jews, all Jewish people of color have opportunities to have dynamic, tender, beautiful, spiritually grounded Jewish experiences. When we can be in spiritual community with each other, when we can transcend some of these intellectual structures that we've created that separate us We can move into other spaces. I have a cousin, Aviva, who's a yogi, and she would say it would put us on a different vibration with each other. She is not wrong. And we need to be on a different vibration with each other. We hope that Jews will have unencumbered access to everything. We hope US Jews are safe from anti-Semitism and also take seriously the imperative to defeat white supremacy. I cannot underscore the importance of that point enough, and that when we create imperatives around anti-Semitism, I want you to focus on the outcome of those imperatives, and I want you to notice that they almost exclusively are in service to white Jews. And when we want to engage people of color around the conversation, we tend to engage people of color to be in service to fighting anti-Semitism. And sometimes we go as far as say things like, remember when we were there for you in the civil rights movement? And we try to invoke a sense of black gratitude. And I want us to push away from that. And I want us to stop expecting black people to be grateful, because it was also not exactly the story we told ourselves in the civil rights movement. And we cannot expect people of color to want to be in relationship to fight anti-Semitism if we're perpetuating racism. And one of the ways we can measure to what extent the US Jewish community is successful in fighting racism is what it looks like inside of here. And communities of color are watching us. And they're evaluating us. And when they see us do things in multiracial relationship, they also see us. And it brings a sense of relief. I was speaking in Baltimore one year, and I had a driver, and I just want to qualify this. I didn't have a driver like I had a driver driving me. I went to the wrong hotel. The Lyft driver said, "You're at the wrong hotel." And he said, like, if you let me take you around, I'll charge you like $200 to drive you around for the week. It's an African-American guy. I was like, great. 4 days into the trip, he says to me, my daughter is marrying a Jewish guy. And he said, I've spent the last 4 days with you, and I learned a couple of things. One is I didn't know Jews knew that Jews of color existed. Black people know Jews of color existed, but we didn't know if you all knew Jews of color existed. The second thing he said is, being in relationship all week and seeing your community struggle, we might say for the sake of heaven, made him develop a level of trust and comfort. And he said, next time I pick somebody up from the airport and they're Jewish, and they ask, do you know where there's Jewish community? He said, I can take them here. I can take them there. Here's all the things I can do. And all that happened was he was able to observe us in a multiracial state. And it made him trust, be in a relationship, and then became an advocate. And then he became an advocate. Let me end with this. Let me end with this. I have to challenge you. And I have to agitate you. And I have to ask you to not even beyond, like, I'm not even interested in you all being uncomfortable. I'm not interested in being uncomfortable because you've already mastered discomfort by surviving the last 3 years. Right? We're all masters of discomfort at this point. And we all are masters to the point where we don't recognize it anymore. What I want is to ask you to recognize when you're not comfortable anymore. And I want you to exist in a state of feeling agitated for a while. I want you to be agitated every time you walk into a room, and quite frankly, it looks like this. And the numbers are off. And I want you to wonder, where is the rest of this community? Not just Jews of color. Anybody who's underrepresented in this space, I want you to walk into the room and I want you to feel a state of dis-ease when the rooms don't reflect what you know should be true for this community. I want you to experience a sense of dis-ease every time you participate in Jewish communal life and you see a monoracial group speaking on behalf of a multiracial people. Not only because we can speak for ourselves and we can speak as a collective, but because what happens is the decisions that are being made the policies that are being put in place are affecting, it doesn't matter about us, but they're being put in place and affecting the young people that are coming after us. And we owe them better than this. We owe them better than 80% of Jews of color feeling discriminated against. We owe our young people more than 41% feel comfortable hanging out with white people. We owe this community more because it's relying on us. They're relying on us, and I'm relying on you. And so with that, I'll stop talking and take some questions. Thank you.